Ladies and gentlemen, theology is one of the human undertakings traditionally described as sciences. There are not only the natural sciences. Humanistic sciences also seek to apprehend a specific object and its setting in the manner directed by this phenomenon itself. They seek to understand it on its own terms and to speak of it along with all the consequences of its existence. The word theology seems to signify a special science, a very special science, whose task is to apprehend, to understand, and speak of God. But many things can be meant by the word God. And there are correspondingly many kinds of theologies. There is no man who does not have his own God or gods as the object of his highest desire and trust, or as the basis of his deepest bond and commitment. There is no one who is not to this extent also a theologian. There is also no religion, no philosophy, no worldview that is not dedicated to some such divinity. Every worldview, even those confessed, let us say in the Swiss and in the American national anthems, presuppose a divinity interpreted in one way or another and worshipped to some degree, whether thoroughly or superficially. There is no philosophy that is not to some extent also theology. Not only does this fact apply to philosophers who desire to affirm, or who at least are ready to admit that divinity in a positive sense is the essence of truth and power of some sort of highest principle. The same truth is valid even for thinkers denying such a divinity, since a denial would in practice merely consist in transferring an identical dignity and function to some other object. This might be nature, creativity, or an unconscious and amorphous will to life. It might also be reason, progress, or the man who thinks and acts progressively, or even a redeeming nothingness into which man would be destined to enter. Even apparently godless ideologies are theologies. The purpose of this lecture is not to give an introduction to the world of these many theologies with their many gods. We will not compare them historically or offer critical conjectures. No position will be taken in the name and in favor of one against all the others, and neither will the others be subordinated and related to this one. There is no apparent reason why these many theologies should have anything essential in common with what we want to discuss under the title Theology. It is not clear how we could fruitfully set them in relation to our task. Among themselves, they have one thing in common, something that immediately casts a significant light on the gods to which they are dedicated. Each one of them considers and represents itself as the best theology, because even should it not be the only right one, it claims to be more right than the others. From the very beginning, we ought to take warning not to participate in this competition, a warning such as the fable of the three rings gives us. In one of his plays, the German poet Lessing compares the claims of the Jewish, Mohammedan, and Christian religions to the claims of three brothers. Each one of them had received a precious ring from the hands of their dying father. Each claimed to have received the father's one and only precious ring, rather than an exact copy of it. The warning contained in this fable is obvious, even if we do not follow Lessing's opinion, according to which perhaps the genuine ring was lost, and nothing else but copies were left in all brothers' hands. The best theology, not to speak of the only right one, concerning the highest or even the exclusively true and real God, would have the following distinction. It would prove itself. And in this regard, Lessing was altogether right by the demonstration of the Spirit and of power. However, if it should acclaim and proclaim itself, it would, by this very fact, betray that it certainly is not the one true theology. For this reason, we will dispense with any comparison or evaluation that would separate or synthesize the various theologies. Instead, let this simple pointer suffice. The theology to be introduced here is evangelical theology. The explanatory attribute evangelical recalls both the New Testament and at the same time the Reformation of the 16th century. Therefore, it may be taken as a dual affirmation. The theology to be considered here is the one which first achieved unambiguous expression in the New Testament, in the writings of the evangelists, apostles, and the prophets, which sprang up from their hidden roots in the documents of the history of Israel. It is also, however, moreover, the theology newly discovered and accepted by the Reformation of the 16th century. The expression evangelical, however, cannot and should not be intended and understood in a confessional, that is denominational and exclusive sense. This is forbidden, first of all, by the elementary fact that evangelical refers primarily and decisively to the Bible, which is in some way respected by all confessions. Not all so-called Protestant theology is evangelical theology. And there is also evangelical theology in the Roman Catholic and in the Eastern Orthodox sphere, as well as in the many later variations, including deteriorations of the new Reformation beginning. What the word evangelical will here objectively designate is that theology which treats of the God of the gospel. Evangelical signifies the Catholic, ecumenical, not to say conciliar, continuity and unity of theology. Such theology intends to apprehend, to understand, and to speak of the God of the gospel in the midst of the variety of all other theologies, and without any value judgment being implied in distinction from them. This is the God who reveals himself in the gospel, who himself speaks to men and acts among and upon them. Wherever he becomes the object of human science, both its source and its norm, there is evangelical theology. Let us now attempt to describe the act of evangelical theology. An account of its most important characteristics will serve as a prelude to clarify its uniqueness, which derives from its object. Among these characteristics, there is none that, mutatis mutandis, with the necessary changes, could not and would not have to be the characteristic also of other sciences. But we will not discuss this point here. We describe them here to the extent that they are specific characteristics of theological science. In the first place, it was not Lessing who originally forbade evangelical theology to award itself the prize in comparison with other theologies, or, what is more, to pass itself off in any one of its forms, a divine wisdom and doctrine. For the very reason that it is devoted to the God who proclaims himself in the gospel. Evangelical theology cannot claim for itself that authority which belongs to him alone. The God of the gospel is the God who mercifully dedicates and delivers himself to the life of all men, including their theologies. Nevertheless, he transcends, together with the undertakings of all other men, also the enterprise of evangelical theologians. He is the God who again and again discloses himself anew and must be discovered anew. The God over whom theology neither has nor receives disposal. The separation and distinction of this one true God from all the others can only be continually his own deed. This deed cannot be reduplicated by any human science, not even by a theology, which is dedicated specifically to him. Even in this basic consideration, he is without a doubt a God wholly different from those other gods. Those others do not seem to prohibit the theologies which are dedicated to them from boasting that each one is the most right or even the only right theology. On the contrary, those gods even seem to urge the respective theologians to engage in such boasting. Evangelical theology, on the other hand, no doubt can and should base its thought and speech on the decision and deed by which God lets his honor shine and outshine all the gods. But it would definitely not think and speak about these acts if by this it wished to win renown for itself according to the examples of other theologies. For better or for worse, it must set out on and proceed along its own way, a way which is fundamentally and totally different from that of the other theologies. All the same, evangelical theology must not lose patience when it is viewed and understood in the same categories as those others. It must even tolerate being compared and seen in relationship to them under the rubric philosophy of religion. So, let me warn you, for its part, it cannot join in this attempt. It can expect justice for itself only by the fact that God justifies it. It can give only Him and not itself the glory. Evangelical theology is modest theology, just as it is determined to be by its object, that is, by Him who is its subject. In the second place, there are three subordinate presuppositions with which evangelical theology works. The first is a general event, of human existence in its insoluble dialectic, which theology sees confronted by the self-proclamation of God in the gospel. Secondly, there is a particular faith of those men who not only are allowed, but are also ready and willing to acknowledge God's self-proclamation. They know and confess that God is self-authenticating, and also and specifically for them. Thirdly, there is a general and a particular presupposition of reason, the capacity for perception, judgment, and language common to believers as well as to all men. It is this capacity that makes it technically possible for them to participate actively in the theological endeavor for knowledge, an endeavor directed to the God who proclaims Himself in the gospel. However, this does not mean that theology would be ordered or even allowed to choose for its object and theme, in place of God, human existence, or faith, or man's spiritual capacity, even if this should include a special religious capacity, a religious a priori. Such themes, if made dominant, would give the theme God its due only subsequently and incidentally. They could not avoid also arousing the suspicion that God might, after all, only be a façon de parler, a fashion of speaking comparable to the symbolic role of the crown of England. Theology is well aware that the God of the gospel has a genuine interest in human existence, and in fact awakens and calls man to faith in Him. It knows that in this way God claims and arouses man's entire spiritual capacity, in fact more than this spiritual capacity. But Theology is interested in all this because it is primarily and comprehensively interested in God Himself. For its thought and speech, the dominant presupposition is God's own proof of His existence and sovereignty. If theology wished to reverse this relationship, and instead of relating man to God, related God to man, then it would surrender itself to a new Babylonian captivity. It would become the prisoner of some sort of anthropology or ontology that is of an underlying interpretation of existence, of faith, or of man's spiritual capacity. Evangelical theology is neither compelled nor commissioned to such an undertaking. It bides its time and confidently lets things take their course, whatever the way in which existence, faith, and the spiritual capacity of man, his selfhood and self-understanding may present themselves in confrontation with the God of the gospel who precedes them all. With respect to those subordinate presuppositions, theology is, for all its modesty, in an exemplary way, a free science. This means it is a science which joyfully respects the mystery of the freedom of its object, and which in turn is again and again freed by its object from any dependence on subordinate presuppositions. In the third place, the object of evangelical theology is God in the history of His deeds. In this history, He makes Himself known. But in it, He also is who He is. In it, He has and proves both His existence and His essence in a unity which excludes precedence of one over the other. The God of the gospel, therefore, is neither a thing, an item, an object like authors, nor an idea, a principle, a truth, or a sum of truths. God can be called the truth only when truth is understood in the sense of the Greek word aletheia. God's being or truth is the event of His self-disclosure, His radiance as the Lord of all lords, the hallowing of His name, the coming of His kingdom, the fulfillment of His will in His work. The sum of the truth about God is the sequence of the events of His being in His work and radiance, events which, also distinct from one another, may not be considered and stared at in isolation. Let it be noted that evangelical theology should neither repeat, reenact, nor anticipate the history in which God is what He is. Theology cannot make out of this history a work of its own set in action by itself. It must, of course, give an account of this history, presenting and discussing human perceptions, concepts, and linguistic expressions, but it does this appropriately only when it follows the living God in that position of historical events in which He is God. Therefore, in its perception, meditation, and discussion, theology must have the character of a living procession. Evangelical theology would forfeit its object. It would belie and negate itself if it wished to view, to understand, and to describe any one moment of the divine procession in splendid isolation from the others. Instead, theology must describe the dynamic interrelationships which make this procession comparable to a bird in flight, in contrast to the bird in cage. Theology would forfeit its object if it would cease to recount the mighty works of God, transferring its interest instead to the examination of a material God or godly matters. Regardless of what the gods of other theology may do, the God of the gospel rejects any connection with a theology that has become paralyzed and static. Evangelical theology can only be and remain in vigorous motion when its eyes are fixed on the God of the gospel. Again and again it must distinguish between what God made happen and will make happen, between the old and the new, without despising the one or fearing the other. It must clearly discern the yesterday, today, and tomorrow of its own presence and action, without losing sight of the unity. Just from this point of view, evangelical theology is an eminently critical science, since it is continually exposed to judgment and never dispense from the crisis in which it is placed by its object, that is to say, by its living subject. In the first place, the God of the gospel is no lonely God, self-sufficient or self-contained. God, the God of the gospel, is no absolute God in the original sense of being detached from everything that is not himself. To be sure, he has no equal beside him, since an equal would no doubt limit, influence, and determine him. On the other hand, he is not the prisoner of his majesty, as though he were bound to be no more than the personal or impersonal holy author. By definition, the God of Schleiermacher cannot show mercy. The God of the gospel can and does. Just as his oneness consists in the unity of his life as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so in relation to the reality distinct from him, he is free de jure et de facto to be the God of man. He exists neither next to man nor merely above him, but rather with him, by him, and most important of all, for him. He is man's God, not only as Lord, but also as Father, brother, and friend. And this relationship implies neither a diminution nor in any way a denial, but instead a confirmation and exercise of his divine essence itself. I reign in the high and holy place, and with him who is of a contrite and humble spirit. Isaiah 57, verse 15. This he does in the history of his deeds. A God who confronted man simply as exalted, distant, and strange in a divinity without humanity could only be the God of a Evangelion, that is, of bad spell instead of good spell. He would be the God of a scornful, judging, deadly no. Even if he were still able to make himself noticeable to men, he would be a God whom man would have to avoid, from whom he would flee if he were able to flee, whom he would rather not know, since he would not in the least be able to satisfy his demands. Such a God might be embodied by a deified progress, or even more likely by progressive man. Many other theologies may be concerned with such exalted, superhuman, and inhuman gods, who can only be the gods of every sort of bad news or dysangelion. But the God who is the object of evangelical theology is just as lowly as he is exalted. He is exalted precisely in his lowliness, and so his inevitable no is enclosed in his primary yes to man. In this way, what God wills for man is a helpful, healing, and uplifting work. And what he does with him brings peace and joy. Because of this, he is really the God of the Evangelion, the Evangel, the word that is good for men, because it is gracious. With its endeavors in evangelical theology, responds to this gracious yes to God's self-proclamation in his friendliness toward men. It is concerned with God as the God of man, but just for this reason also with men as God's man. For it, man is absolutely not something that must be overcome, as Nietzsche has put it. On the contrary, for evangelical theology, man is the one determined by God to be a conqueror. Strictly speaking, therefore, the word theology fails to exhaust the meaning of evangelical theology. One decisive dimension of the object of theology is not expressed clearly by this word. This dimension is the free love of God that arouses the response of free love, His grace, charis, that calls for gratitude, Eucharistia. The theoanthropotheology would probably express better who and what is at stake here, with the provision that this never should be confused with anthropotheology, as we previously established in point 2. Let us stick to theology as long as we do not forget the one indispensable clarification: this theology is evangelical in the special sense we have just discussed. It is evangelical, and so it can by no means be devoted to an inhuman God, or else it would become legalistic. Evangelical theology is concerned with Emmanuel, God with us. Having this God for its object, it can be nothing else but the most thankful and happy science.
Might we rise for the benediction?